Tonight, it is my great pleasure to welcome Graham Beal to lead off this series. Graham Beal has served as Director, President, and CEO of the Detroit Institute of Arts since 1999. Since joining the DIA, he's overseen 2 major capital campaigns and guided a complete renovation of the DIA's 1927 building, rationalizing its floor plan and bringing it up to current professional standards. The final component of the renovation was an innovative reinstallation of the permanent collection that has attracted international attention. Most recently, in a fantastic display of community support, Director Beal successfully campaigned for the passing of a millage, which put the DIA on secure financial footing for the first time in decades. It's truly a remarkable feat. Director Beal was born in Stratford-on-Avon and grew up near Hastings on the south coast of England. He has degrees in English and art history from the University of Manchester and from the Courtauld Institute of History of Art at the University of London. Director Beal has worked in the museum world for 40 years in a number of institutions in both the United Kingdom and the United States. And for the sake of brevity, I will not list them all, but I will mention his time as chief curator of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art from 1984 to 89, his tenure as director of the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska from 1989 to 96, and his tenure as director of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art from 96 to 1999. Fortunately for the DIA and for all of us here in Michigan, in 1999, Director Beal left Los Angeles to take up his current position. Director Beal has organized over 40 exhibitions, many of which have toured nationally. His publications include books on the American artist, Jim Dine, on contemporary British sculpture, and on the DIA's American art collections. He has served on numerous national and international panels, including those for the National Endowment of the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities, the Federal Advisory Committee on International Exhibitions, and from 2002 to 2005, he was a trustee of the Association of Art Museum Directors and chair of its Arts Issues Committee. Tonight's lecture focuses on the changing meanings of perhaps the most iconic object in the DIA's collection, Diego Rivera's Detroit Industry Murals, from Eyesore and Epiphany to Elegance and Elegy. Please join me in welcoming Director Graham Beal to the University of Michigan.
Thank you. I'm glad you did that.
Good evening. A few years ago, my daughter, without asking for any advice, decided she was going to go to London and get a graduate degree in art history, which she did. And when I was over there on a business trip, she asked me, in London, she asked me if I would be willing to talk to her class. And I said, well, yes, I would, I said, but having seen the kind of courses that they were offering at the university, I said, you must be prepared perhaps to endure a little bit of opposition and maybe even embarrassment. And she said, why is that? And I said, well, I'm old-fashioned. I believe in things. You are being taught theory. And it's that there's been that tremendous gap, and a tremendous division, whereby individuals who did believe in things tended to be accused of privileging objects, and it's been gratifying for me to see over the past few years that gap being narrowed, not to the advantage or disadvantage of either one, but seeing these two things come together. I do passionately believe in things. I'm a failed painter. That's how I first engaged with art. And so this is the kind of thing that brings me to my desk every day. The DIA, here you see the opening of the 1927 building. When it opened, it was something of a revolution. This slide is taken from the 1929 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, where it is used as an example of the ideal modern art museum. It was revolutionary to some degree in the States because rather than following the French method of showing art by medium, sculpture in one gallery, paintings in another, tapestries in another, that kind of thing, it actually took the viewer on a walk through culture. You start here with Egypt, Greece, come all the way around here, all the way up to modern European art. Same for America on the other side, with temporary exhibitions in the middle. That's now all the American wing. And then the rest of the world packed into this suite of galleries here. But it was a very clear, very legible building. And when you came in the main entrance down here into the great entrance hall and into the main hall, you progressed through the main hall, and as you can see, glimpse through the yelling gates there into the garden court, which is what this looked like in when it opened in 1927. The paintings on the walls here, that's a Pendergast, and this is an Augustus John painting, were basically bought as holding pieces because it was always the plan of the architect Paul Cray, as well as the director William Valentina, to have these walls for murals. And obviously there was a kind of assumption, certainly in the architect Paul Cray's mind, that this would be some Arcadian or bucolic kind of scene. But as we all know, that is not what happened. There you see, I love this slide because there in the full blast of the sunlight is our Burne-Jones tapestry, which we hardly ever put up at all these days. But here's Valentina with his patron Eyesore Ford. He was in California in the summer of 1931, and he met Rivera, who was painting this mural in San Francisco. Allegorical kind of thing, sort of symbolic. It's all about industry and agriculture. But a single, the piece above, but basically a single mural that has people and things that symbolize what's great about California. And that presumably is what Valentina had something like that in mind when he asked Rivera if he would be interested in doing a mural in the new DIA. Rivera was in the country at the time because of his retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. It's more credible now than it was 40 years ago, but the first single artist retrospective at MoMA was that of Matisse, and the second one was of Diego Rivera. That was the high regard that he was held in at that time. Second only to Matisse, with Picasso presumably coming a little bit later. Rivera said yes. He came to Detroit in April '32, went to the new, as it was then, Rouge plant, and spent a couple of months making sketches and making photographs. This is the kind of sketch in the sketchbooks that he made there. This is the kind of photograph that he took because he was very concerned about getting things right, and with one exception insisted that all of the equipment that would be seen in the two murals would be up to date and not obsolete. Here he is with Mrs. Ford, an English lord, and his wife, Frida, of course, the Lord Hastings, Frida Kahlo, and an unknown gentleman. Frida hated it in Detroit. She went to New York as frequently as she could. Here she is painting in what was then the hotel across the road from the DIA. She also had the great disaster of her miscarriage when she was here in Detroit, the painting the Henry Ford Hospital. But Rivera went to work. He took sketches like this with the photographs, and I think you can see from the framework there's these big pylons here with the beams going across, that is what this basically became. This is the presentation drawing that he made to Eyesore Ford after dinner one night at the Eyesore Ford house. And you can see from this that although there are differences in many of the details of the finished work, the south wall of the museum where the Burne-Jones had been hanging, there are differences in the predella, programmatic differences, and differences in detail. But when Eyesore Ford became demonstrably excited by this whole project, somehow, and history is not clear on this, Rivera was able to produce drawings for a scheme that would cover all of the panels in the gallery, in the court, and right there and then, Eyesore Ford and Rivera negotiated a deal, and it was a deal. Rivera got a much bigger canvas to work with, but Eyesore Ford got a reduced price on Rivera's customary $100 a square foot. And this is what it would have looked like had they just stuck with the commission. And it would clearly, I don't have, this is the north wall, I didn't get ask the photographer to do one of those as well, but you can see as an experience it would be very much looking at this one over here and then turning and looking at the other one, or being able to stand back and sort of see both. But what Rivera gave instead with the final work was a much more, this is what it would have been looked like. You'd start with the making of the steel up here, then winding its way through the conveyor line, down here working on the blocks, moving over here, so the cars are being assembled, being brought down here, and then finally being the body being put together with the chassis, and then finally going out of the museum. And this slide, even at this scale, is so inadequate I can't actually pick out the only complete car in the whole mural, which is a little car sideways painted red, which had to be a comment by the communist Rivera. What he gave instead, however, was this kind of experience. Even looking at one of the walls, it sort of overwhelms you, it sort of leans over you in a way that the single panel did not. And he moved from telling the story of building a car and the men who did it, to putting together components that talk about a number of dualities: the old and the new, the good and the bad, the organic, the inorganic, organic, inorganic, rocks against nature, man against nature, identifying what he identified as the four races, gave for one person to do this is quite remarkable. At this time, if you were planning murals in most countries, you would hire someone to write a program for you in a sort of Renaissance way. But Rivera, as far as we know, developed this whole thing in all its complexity entirely by himself. And here is the south wall with the other two races, and you can see on the previous wall we had the hands coming up there with the rocks, the same kind of thing here on the south wall. Here is just quickly the people who Rivera worked with. He did all the painting, but he had a number of assistants who came to Detroit specifically to work with him. The museum paid for his fee and all the materials, and some of the materials were very expensive, like lapis lazuli. Rivera was responsible for paying his assistants, and one way that he did that was by not paying his assistants, who had to learn to find ways to trade drawings for dental bills and food, until one of them, Halberstadt, who was the main skillful plasterer, threatened to go on strike outside the museum with a placard saying "Rivera unfair to labor," and Rivera gave in. But one of the people who was also working on the mural didn't speak to Halberstadt for 6 weeks. And there of course is Diego in the characteristic position of his arm around someone else's wife. Here we see him working, painting the whole thing himself. I juxtaposed these two pieces together so you can see the way that he was working. And here they are just about to get ready for the opening. There's Rivera looking quite smart down in the corner. There are contradictory reports or accounts, some of which say that the mural was kept absolutely secret. No one was allowed to go in there, and that the controversy when it was afterwards exploded. That doesn't seem to have been the case. They seem to have let people in. I have a now quite aged trustee who, when he was a little boy, his mother was a Spanish teacher, she took him into the court and he shook the hand of Diego Rivera, who was in there actually painting the mural. So the evidence is that people were coming, seeing what was going on quite a bit. So as you walk oh, that's what I was doing. Wrong way. As you walk in now from the Great Hall, this is what you see as you walk in. The fetus, the source of life that's embedded in a uterus, the veins of which have both organic and inorganic feel to them. It's sort of a universal message with these very luscious-looking individuals here with the fruits of the earth. And then if you turned around, you would see at the other end of the wall everything to do with what are, for this purpose of this lecture, called man. Not only that, you have, whereas you had nothing but good on the natural side, here you have war on one side and peace on the other, with the dove and the eagle. And then you also have a grisaille relief showing rubber going from what was then Malaysia coming over to the city of Detroit to be, that is the skyline of Detroit at that time. And the example of the kind of the old and the new and the mix of the cultures, here Rivera portraying the Mexican life-death mask, building it into the program, referencing ancient America through his own Mexican tradition. And also referencing Mexican tradition, this pressing machine was actually obsolete. There was one in the factory when this painting was being made where this whole thing was sheathed, and you couldn't see any of the workings inside. But here, Rivera is using it. This is the god of war and creation. You could see how he's mimicked it with this great stamping machine with these individuals down here with their the hair being stood on end by the force of the air coming down for the stamping machine. And there is Rivera and Ford, Renaissance patrons, in the corner. He brought together dualities of individuals. The American Engineer is a composite portrait of Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, who were the best of friends. Some individuals think that Rivera distorted this dynamo form to make it look more like a human ear, because Ford constantly spied on his employees, sent squads of people around to make sure there was no alcohol in anyone's home, that kind of thing, chastised wives who weren't keeping the house clean enough. In the American Engineer, the American Worker is an idealized combination of Rivera himself and an idealized American worker. He got away with lovely little things like this, the red star on the glove, communism. Actually, there was at that time a company in Detroit called the Red Star Glove Company. So you've got these nice little, these clever little jabs built into it. And he himself can be found in solidarity with workers being poisoned by the processes, the very processes of making a car there in the derby hat. And so that is the whole thing. It's complex. It has all sorts of things going on backwards and forwards across the planes, but not only across the planes also across the room. Just get the right slides here. This is actually looking at the south wall, but if you were looking at the north wall, you would see this painting on one end and this panel on the other end. In other words, putting together the good and the not so good of modern chemistry. But then if you look at that panel there, or that top corner of that wall, and then look across the room over the embryo, you will see this piece here where you see technology and medicine being used for the good of mankind. Similarly at the other end of the panel. So you have not only have all of these messages mixing in mixing together, you actually have sort of physical connections that you have to move through to be able to make them. And then he made the predella. The predella turned from being a series of vignettes about aspects of car building to a day in the life of a worker, starting with the workers clocking in the morning and getting them leaving in the afternoon. Talk about the change in meaning. In this time, people looking at this mural in the early 30s would have understood completely that these were cars that had been made by these people, all this abundance out here. I've actually heard tour guides say, and here are the workers going off at the end of the day to their cars to go home. So, you know, wasn't quite like that. In fact, and this is the bridge, the overpass in which the disastrous, murderous events happened a few years later in the labor strife. And in the middle of the predella, little jokes like this. Here is Henry Ford teaching. The engine has been turned into a dog. The feet here refer to the fact that one of the reasons the auto industry was established in Detroit was because Michigan was a great center for making wood stoves. And so those are the paws that you see on stoves. These apprentices here being taught look simian because they were known as monkeys, and they thought that anybody stupid enough to want to work on the assembly line must be as foolish as a monkey. But he also puts this young man in the position of that's famous to all of us from Rodin's Thinker, which was right outside in the hall there. So at that time, Rivera was making reference to that. And then in the background, you have Henry Ford's hand making the John the Baptist gesture, and then in the background you have students reading that are made to look as if they're kowtowing to the great hand of Henry Ford. So a lot of complexity in this. There is Edsel Ford, and this is the claim that 50,000 jam Art Institute to see disputed murals. I think has to be taken with a pinch of salt, because we had 60,000 people in the DIA for the first 36 hours that we were open. The DIA is now 3 times the size that it was in 1927, and it was sometimes frightening to see the crush of people that were in there. But anyway, it was a well attended event. People turned up. Contrary to most of the stories, while there was controversy, most people, in fact, were very excited by it. There was the newspaper whipped up the battle of the murals, and we now have very strong indications from oral histories that Edsel Ford himself used his own publicity office to stir up a controversy, because he was paying the salaries of the individual still on the staff at the DIA in the early 30s. And people were no longer going to the museum. So the theory is that Ford commissioned this to ignite excitement with the DIA again, so that the city would go back to paying the salaries of the staff members, and that's exactly what happened. Ford was paying something like $230,000 towards salaries in 1933 when this opened, and in 1934 the city of Detroit voted a grant of $440,000 to the. So it worked. In this case, you can view it as a piece of propaganda, as some people did, but also looking at a piece of superb commercial manipulation. And then, of course, in the 1950s, with the House Un-American Committee activities, this is Edgar Richardson, the man who succeeded William Valentina, and I don't know how much of this you can see, but it says there, Rivera's politics and his publicity seeking are detestable, but let's get the record straight at what he did here. Then he goes on to say this is a great work of art celebrating a great world city, and that's, of course, what it was. This was very much a living testimony to what in the 50s was once again an extraordinarily wealthy and prosperous city. At this time, however, other things were going on, and this is a diagram drawn by Ad Reinhardt, for a now defunct art magazine, where you can see that the tree of modernism, with all of the important things now, is being dragged down by the weight of the Mexican art muralists. So by the 50s, it was already being seen as something of a relic, something old-fashioned and rather fusty, and having little to do with the modernism that it's the kind of which it seemed to praise in the 1930s. Sometime in the museum they took out that huge fountain, but I don't know if they had if they were nervous, and they put in this little fountain up in the corner there, which is very, very, very strange. You can see it doesn't really help the mural much at all. The other thing that about being with the murals, not only with the scale and the way that you have Rothko would have approved the kind of physical relationship that you have with the mural as you move around in it. There is extraordinary texture and painterliness about seeing this particular thing, particular object up close. When the mural was first opened, this is one of the few portraits in the mural. Well, there are actually not few. There are a number of murals in the portraits that are of actual people. Most of the times they're models for people in the mural. In this case, this is an actual portrait, not, as is often asserted, of Harry Bennett, Ford's enforcer, but of a guy who worked for Harry Bennett called Sorensen. But it's an unfavourable rendering of an individual who was responsible for controlling the speed of the assembly line, and that controlled the number of injuries that were going to happen at whatever speed you were moving. In the background, you used to be able to visit, well, you can again now, visit the Rouge plant. Here are the bourgeoisie looking at the workers, the noble workers. They're an extremely unpleasant looking bunch of people, but we do have Dick Tracy back here. We have No Face here. We have what I was recently told is an unflattering portrait of the President of Mexico at the time. You have the Katzenjammer kids with their beanie hats, and you have this sour-looking Catholic lady with an equally sour-looking individual. All of these kinds of things are something that you can notice in a certain quality of reproduction, but you just cannot get into it. And I was standing in the court last week, saying to someone, I've been here for 13 years, and I think I finally look at it and I see a detail. I don't see any details that I haven't seen before. And as I said that, I saw something that hadn't really registered before. It's for all the clarity of the structure, it's very, very complicated, very, very detailed. When I was asked by some Mexican officials how I thought that they could reproduce this for an exhibition in Mexico, and I just said, well, there's modern technology. I don't know what it'll cost, but I suppose you can reproduce it. Anyway, all of these wonderful details. Here is the assembly line. These are portraits of men who worked with Rivera. There's Halberstadt again. But this is the one piece of the mural that is, along with the pressing machine, I suppose, this is completely unrealistic. This is a utopian view of what the assembly line would have looked like. All of the people working on the assembly line at that time would have been white. The dirty jobs would have gone to the people of colour. But this is, where is he? I don't know. He's not in this picture, but Rivera's specialist chemist is in there. But what you also, as you look at these individuals working here, especially this group here, when you're standing in front of this thing, you can see that this was the work that Rivera did in a day. This is the day's work, the Italian word for a day's work. And when you stand in front of these things, you can see how Rivera has covered it a little bit, but the very nature of fresco means that the paint has a kind of transparency, and you get a strong sense of the amount of work that Rivera could reasonably do in a day. And there are 30 or so of these particular day-long episodes. And you also are able to see this inscription here, where Rivera says that this work of art was done at the time of Valentina, was the director, and given to the Art Institute of Detroit by Eyesore Ford, who was the president of the Arts Commission. So other details like this. And if you look at this piece here, especially in reproduction, but it's not until you get close to this kind of thing that you can see the kind of painstaking detail with the reflection that Rivera was putting into this mural. This is one of the details that I only really looked at very, very, very recently. And I thought I'd throw in, this is a little bit misleading, I'd sort of throw in a couple of reproductions from the DIA's own resources. This is the fold-out that you get if you buy Linda Down's book on Rivera that gives you the impression of what one of the walls looks like. And this is from a postcard that we sell in the museum shop. And I asked our wonderfully skillful photographers to be as true as they could to this, but these look much more, the color of these two things look much more similar than they actually are. And again, return to it's obviously a slam dunk in a way to say that you can't avoid an object like this if you're talking about experiencing the thing as opposed to reproduction. But I use this slide to hope to demonstrate that there is no way that you even come remotely close to conveying the strength and the power that this work can convey when you step into it. More often than not, when I take a guest into this room, they gasp audibly, just can't help themselves. And so that's our big Mona Lisa. That's the work of art that we're known for, that people come to look for, and it is something that you have to see. You cannot experience it. Rivera proclaimed that it was his most successful mural, and most of my Mexican colleagues agree that this is, even though it's not in Mexico, this was the best one. But I'm finishing with some slides that in a way may also state the obvious of an object like this, Bernini's Modello for the throne of St. Peter's, currently on its way to an exhibition at the Met. These are two slides of the same object taken from just about the same angle, when for deliberate reasons, the photographers chose to make them look like this for their particular publication. You get a sense in this photograph of the scraping and the carving that you see much more forcefully if the vitrine is open and you can look at the back. But this is about as close to the original that I found. But and there's another one. So you get those, you get to convey what it looks like, and of course you can do holograms that make it turn around. But the actual physicality that you see in a work like this, which accompanies the throne, if you're lucky enough to get close enough and see beyond the scrapings, and you can see this with the naked eye in front of these, you see what is almost certainly Bernini's fingerprints on the work to that scale. I couldn't find a slide that corresponded with that one. Here's three examples of our Van Gogh. This taken in the 80s, this taken in the 90s, and this taken in the last decade. And this one, the palest in a way of them, is the one that is closer to the original. When these kinds of obviously technology improves all the time, and this kind of reproduction it gets closer all the time, as we can see from this progression. But photographers are still in the business of taking a painting like a Van Gogh and then putting the camera on it, and because it's not a flat surface, they get all of these reflections, light bouncing around. So the first thing they have to do is to polarize the whole thing, shut it down, sometimes double polarize it, and then take the picture so they don't have all the light bouncing around, and then go back in and work with it. And depending on the technology, with the old in the 80s, this was considered close. This to the photographer who made this print and to the person who accepted it at the time was the best they could do to come close to what the original was. We come, as I say, we come much closer now with all this digital technology and the incredible focus that we're capable of. But when planning this lecture and burdening my colleague, the photographers, with requests for pictures, they said that basically in their business they don't talk about reproductions, they talk about representations, because whatever they do, they can only represent an aspect or two of the work of art that they are looking at. Here is one of our Modiglianis. It's not as clear as it is but up here there's a little bit of the weave showing through. And when this piece was on view as part of our Inside Out program, where we've been putting reproductions of works up around, I was at one of those sites and looked at this, and looking more closely at it, I saw this component here, and it was odd. It was like a double take. It was such a superb photograph that it was obvious that this was a three-dimensional object made on weave that made me think I need to go back and look at that at the museum again, because that was a good representation of what the original work of art conveys. But that's all it is. And here is the painting as seen flat on in a polarized version and tampered with version. This is from our conservation laboratory, where it's been photographed in raking light, and you can see the kind of thing that the photographers are talking about when they say first of all they have to deal with is the real light bouncing around on what is effectively a three-dimensional object. And I'll close with an example that both, I hope, reinforces what I was saying, but also stresses the fact that we are getting very, very good at representation. We recently borrowed for a month the Vermeer, a woman holding a balance from the National Gallery, and we decided to show it alongside our De Hoog and our Ter Borch. It was a cruel thing to do to these two artists, because to our way of thinking about what a good painting is, the De Hoog looked much more like the 19th century simpering, sentimental picture that it became. The Vermeer, it was clear, is why we value it today, an object that is about paint. It is about three dimensions. And the Ter Borch was all about being very, very clever at being able to manipulate surfaces to create simulations of things like satin. But by way of our preferences today, Vermeer is the one. It is the artist who really matters. The fact that he was literally written out of the history books in the 18th and early 19th centuries and had to be put back together again by scholars. Our Ter Borch may have been attributed to Ochteveld, I'm not sure, but another artist. And I put the three together, and I hope it sort of makes the point that while on the one hand these paintings, the technology today enables us to get a sense of what the differences may be, as I think is the case with since we've had colour photography that makes us want to look more at the painting than we did before. It wasn't a deterrent to going to the museum. So I feel quite confident that the growing technology in terms of reproducing works of art will be able to highlight the kinds of things that make us want to see the original object as well. The other aspects of being able to use using virtual methods and having technology. I think if you've been to the DIA, you've seen that we're trying to be experimental with this kind of thing and trying to use all of these various technologies to enhance the experience of actually visually groping with the object in front of you. And I'll close just by reinforcing that every single label, descriptive label, every single interactive, the final test is, does this device make the viewer want to look back at the work of art again, rather than taking the information and walking away? And we're finally getting in the findings. It does seem to be working overall. Ironically, the one that people seem to be more satisfied with anything else is the one that's become the kind of the icon of our reinstallation. When people have sat through the dining table for 5 minutes, they tend not to go back and look at the objects. So we've given them a virtual experience. I don't know what we're going to do about it, and it satisfied them to the extent that the objects that we thought they would then stand up and just go and look at the Epiphany over there and go and look at the candlesticks over there. It actually isn't working that way, but everybody loves the dining table. Thank you very much.
The last time I spent significant time in the Rivera court was in 2008 with the Museum Studies cohort, and at that time you had some interactive consoles that visitors could rent or borrow and sort of use the touch screen to explore aspects of the mural in more detail. I wonder if you can talk more about the history of interpreting that mural for visitors who maybe don't want to do a guided tour, whether that was successful and what's there now.
Yes, it's a handheld device, and originally it was just about like a BlackBerry, and you pick how you want to enter the work of art, and you pick one of 4 stories in this case, one about the making of the mural, one about Rivera himself, one about being a worker on the assembly line. I forget what the 4th one is about. There are other points of information too, but you can pick how you want to start interpreting this complicated thing that's around you. The evidence coming back in that it's very, very successful, but its real success only came when we came upon its 3rd iteration of technology. First of all, we had the BlackBerry type thing, then we had a slightly bigger one, but by the 3rd year, we were already using the iPad. And so that's how fast this kind of thing is moving. I'm happy to say that the iPad seems to work fantastically well, and it's now in its second year, and we're not looking to making any changes. That's another challenge of technology. When people get used to looking to an iPad, this ceases to be anything other than a frustration. And I'm obviously old-fashioned you still have one of those. So.
Thank you for the lecture. I have a question about the commission, because you said that he was in Detroit in April of 32. And so in some of the literature about the commissioning of the painting, there's a discussion of the hunger strike that happened on the 7th of March of the same year, when Henry Ford or some worker at the Rouge plant ordered for the police to fire on the strike, on the hunger strike. And I know there's one story that Diego Rivera was told by Eyesore Ford that was actually a pro-labor parade. But then there's a sort of obscurity about, did he find out that happened? What's the sort of backstory in relation to his discovery, or did he ever know that had happened? And I've heard a few different versions. I wonder if you would share yours.
Well, as we all know, Rivera got kicked out of the Communist Party twice. He was an extremely unorthodox, idiosyncratic communism, and certainly a man who came to the US regularly and painted flattering portraits of society people, which is where he earned all his money, had an ambivalent relationship to classical communism. And the material that I've come across would indicate that Rivera really wasn't interested in that kind of activity. He was first and foremost, he had his philosophical beliefs, but first and foremost he was an artist. And Linda Downs, in her book, in a much more decorous way, seems to indicate that Rivera got out of town as quickly as he could when those particular activities started. But he was finished, he was done. It was just a week before.
Graham, I have a question. I'd like to see if we can bring the talk back to the nature of the series that's intended to examine the nature of the object. I'm interested in your use of the term representations when you're talking about what others would call reproductions of works of art in the collection. I'm wondering, from your perspective as a museum director, if you can talk a little bit about those qualities of of artifacts in their original state that can be captured in a reproduction, and those qualities that might be utterly lacking in a reproduction.
Well, I think using the word representation as a reproduction, to me, implies something that successfully reproduces something. That it is, if not necessarily a replica, but it's, it's a child or something. It has its own validity, whatever it exists in that, as complementary in that university. When you're looking, as many of you know, I'm sure from having worked on producing books, you have to make decisions about what you want to be brought to the fore in whatever it is that you're working with, publishing or reproducing, because you're not going to be able to capture, even in a so-called two-dimensional object, you're not going to be able to capture all of those qualities that exist to the naked eye. Now, I was reading a number of years ago about the British government, the British Museum, different from the British government, was thinking of offered the Greeks an incredibly expensive reproduction of the Elgin marbles, made by a laser technology of phenomenal expense, but I presume it has something to do with these three-dimensional printers that we have now, where the detail would be so good, so accurate, that the human eye wouldn't be able to differentiate between the Elgin original and the reproduction. And of course, the Greeks' answer was pretty obvious: that, well, you keep the reproduction, and we'll take the original. So the story goes. But absent that kind of instance, you're, as the Van Gogh picture showed, I think you're making decisions as to what kind of representation you want of that work of art that will reinforce whatever idea it is that you're trying to get across. And that's the best that we can do these days.
If I could just add a comment. I think one of the things that entrances me anyway, and I think many museum visitors, about original objects is that they're objects that have history. And so, I mean, this is one thing. You can talk about just the purely visual properties of an object. It has a very different history from the kind of history that you've just laid out for these murals. And I think that should remain a part of these conversations. I don't know if you had a thought about that, but the history of objects.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, probably the ownership, what it's gone through. There's that famous jab at Lord Clark that I think John Berger made in his series, where he shows, he says, this is a painting by Van Gogh, and it's crows in a wheat field, and he said, this is the painting that Van Gogh was painting when he shot himself. And what does that do to that object? So, yeah, for all sorts of reasons, the history of the ownership is something that, I mean, romanticism or other things, but just the thought that these objects have existed through, and in your case, so much time before ending up in this rather strange position as being valued for its, primarily for its visual qualities. And I mean, that again, that is something that we've tried to build into aspects of the reinstallation, the whole question of the history of an object that was made for a Russian Tsarina, that was sold by Stalin, that was bought by a wealthy American woman who then left it to the museum, that the sense that this went through these different lives, different identities, different reasons for being around. Everything from decorating a house in Grosse Pointe to financing the 5-year plan of Stalin. You know. Thank you very much.